Søren Kierkegaard. Let's start with the father of existentialism. He was born in Copenhagen in 1813 into a very religious and strict household. His father's deep guilt and harsh piety shaped him. Søren grew up obsessed with questions of faith, freedom, and despair. By 27, he was publishing works so bold that people in Denmark both mocked and feared him. Here's his core idea. Life is filled with anxiety, that uneasy awareness of our freedom. For Kierkegaard, anxiety isn't weakness, it's a signal. You're standing at the edge of possibility. But when we ignore the responsibility, we fall into despair, which he described as the sickness unto death. So how do we escape it? Kierkegaard said, we can't reason our way out. Meaning doesn't come from philosophy textbooks or society's rules. It takes what he called the leap of faith, choosing to place trust in God, not because it's proven, but because the very act of committing gives life weight and direction. He lived this belief, broke off his engagement, rejected career comfort, and wrote book after book as if speaking directly to the individual reader. He even called himself a singular, a reminder that truth isn't found in the crowd, but in personal choice. Though he died young at 42, Kierkegaard's writings lit the spark that would later guide thinkers like Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre. His legacy? He turned human anxiety and despair into starting points, not dead ends. He showed that our trembling before the void is exactly where authentic life begins. Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844 in a small Prussian town, grew up the son of a Lutheran pastor. His father died when he was just 5, leaving a shadow over him. A brilliant student, by age 24 he became the youngest professor of philology in Europe. But instead of lecturing in dusty classrooms, Nietzsche wanted to shake the foundations of Western thought. His most famous line, God is dead, wasn't a celebration, it was a diagnosis. He argued that traditional religion and morality were collapsing in modern Europe. When centuries of faith vanished, he warned, people risked falling into nihilism, the belief that nothing has meaning. Nietzsche's alternative? The will to power, the vital drive in humans to shape, create, and overcome. Rather than seeking comfort or obedience, life demands we harness struggle as the source of growth. Connected to this is his thought experiment of eternal recurrence. Imagine living your exact life, every joy and mistake, over and over for eternity. Would you embrace it? He used this test to measure how fully you were living. At the heart of it all was his challenge. Become who you are. Reject shallow conformity, reject herd thinking, and forge your identity through self-overcoming. Nietzsche's last decade was tragic. Mental collapse left him silent until his death in 1900. But his influence only grew. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus, psychologists like Freud, and even artists and revolutionaries carried forward his radical call to face meaninglessness and create our own values. Nietzsche didn't just question God. He forced us to question whether we have the courage to live as creators of meaning in a world without certainty. Martin Heidegger, born in 1889 in rural Germany, began training for the priesthood but turned instead to philosophy, studying under Edmund Husserl, the father of phenomenology. By his mid-30s, Heidegger had rewritten philosophy's central question, not what things exist, but what does it mean to exist at all? His masterwork, Being and Time, introduced the concept of Dasein, literally being there, his term for human existence. Unlike abstract theories about man, Dasein means you, me, each of us thrown into a world we didn't choose, facing choices we can't avoid. He said most people live in inauthenticity, absorbed in daily routines, gossip, and distractions, what he called the they. True authenticity emerges when we confront our ultimate limit, death. Knowing our time is finite wakes us up. Instead of drifting, we realize every choice matters and that meaning is ours to create. For Heidegger, philosophy wasn't armchair speculation. It was an urgent call to live deliberately, to seize our finite existence instead of burying it under busyness and comfort. But his story carries serious shadows. In the 1930s, Heidegger joined the Nazi Party. His political choices have haunted his legacy ever since. Still, his ideas reshaped existentialism, influenced Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, and even modern psychology and literature. Heidegger's enduring challenge is stark but empowering. Face your mortality, tear yourself free from the they, and step into authenticity. In short, only by confronting death can you truly live. Jean-Paul Sartre, born in Paris in 1905, became the face of 20th century existentialism. Brilliant and restless, he studied philosophy at the École Normale, where he met Simone de Beauvoir, his lifelong partner and intellectual equal. Together, they built an existentialist movement that spilled out of classrooms into cafes, theaters, and politics. Sartre's central claim is summed up in 4 words: existence precedes essence. Unlike objects, a knife, for example, built with a given purpose, humans arrive with no fixed blueprint. We exist first, then define ourselves through our actions. That freedom is exhilarating, but also terrifying. When we dodge that responsibility, Sartre said we fall into bad faith, lying to ourselves by pretending we're bound by fate, society, or roles we didn't choose. His example, a waiter who hides his freedom by acting waiter, as if that's all he is. Authentic life means admitting you always have a choice. Even not choosing is itself a choice. World War II sharpened his message. Sartre joined the resistance and later insisted that philosophy couldn't stay in ivory towers. He wrote plays, novels, and essays to show how freedom and responsibility unfold in real lives. After the war, being and nothingness became a global sensation, and his slogan, "We are condemned to be free," captured a generation searching for meaning in chaos. Though controversial, he turned down the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1964. Sartre's legacy is massive. He left us with a bracing but empowering truth. The world may be absurd, but meaning isn't given. It's made, moment by you. Simone de Beauvoir, born in Paris in 1908, grew up in a Catholic bourgeois family but rejected its restrictive path early. Brilliant and fiercely independent, she studied philosophy at the Sorbonne, where she met Jean-Paul Sartre. The two shared a lifelong partnership, but make no mistake, Beauvoir was not his shadow. She carved her own voice as one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. Her defining work, The Second Sex, 1949, laid the foundation for existential feminism. She opened with a striking line, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." What did she mean? Biology gives us facts, but society builds roles and expectations that trap women into what she called immanence, a life of passivity, dependence, and limitation. Existentialism, she argued, demanded more. Just as Sartre claimed humans are free to define themselves, women must claim that same authentic freedom. The problem is that patriarchy denies them transcendence, the ability to project outward, act, and create meaning on equal terms. Gender, then, isn't destiny. It's a cultural cage that both women and men have to break. Beauvoir lived her philosophy. She wrote novels, essays, memoirs, and marched in political campaigns for women's rights, workers' rights, and against colonialism. She showed that existentialism isn't just about individual angst, but about how freedom collides with systems of oppression. When she died in 1986, tens of thousands turned out at her funeral. Today, she's remembered not only as Sartre's intellectual partner, but as the woman who reframed existentialism for half of humanity. Her legacy, freedom is never abstract, it's political, relational, and always unfinished. Albert Camus, born in French Algeria in 1913, grew up poor. His father died in World War I, and his mother raised him while barely literate. Despite hardship, Camus won scholarships, studied philosophy, and played goalkeeper in soccer, an image he loved because a goalie lives in constant suspense, waiting for the next absurd shot. Camus is often linked to existentialism, but he resisted the label. His focus wasn't existence precedes essence, but the absurd, the collision between our hunger for meaning and the silent, indifferent universe. In his famous essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, he retells the Greek legend of the man condemned to roll a boulder uphill forever. For Camus, that endless futility symbolized human life. The question is, knowing the struggle never ends, why not abandon altogether? Camus' shocking claim, the only real philosophical question is whether life is worth living. His answer, yes, but only if we face the absurd openly, without illusions, and live in defiance. Like Sisyphus, he argued, we must imagine ourselves happy, not because the universe has meaning, but because we choose to embrace it. Politically and personally, Camus practiced this. He opposed totalitarianism on both the left and right, split from Sartre over Soviet atrocities, and championed human dignity during the Algerian conflict. He even won the Nobel Prize in Literature at just 44. Tragically, he died in a car crash at 46. Manuscript of an unfinished novel in his bag. Camus' lasting message is bracingly simple. We can't escape the absurd, but we can live fully, rebelliously, and joyfully within it. Karl Jaspers, born in Germany in 1883, didn't even start as a philosopher. He first trained as a psychiatrist, writing textbooks that shaped modern clinical psychology. But soon he grew frustrated. Psychology could describe symptoms, he argued, but couldn't capture the experience of being human. That drove him into philosophy, where he became one of the early voices of existential thought. Jaspers said life reveals its depth most powerfully in what he called limit situations. These are moments you can't control or escape. Death, guilt, suffering, conflict. They crush the illusion that you're safe inside routines. Instead, they confront you with the fragile, uncertain edge of existence itself. For Jaspers, these situations can feel like walls. But paradoxically, hitting the wall is what opens the possibility of transcendence. By facing mortality or enduring despair, we're pushed to break beyond shallow answers and ask ultimate questions about meaning and freedom. He saw philosophy not as abstract theory, but as a journey, an act of what he called existence, becoming fully oneself through confrontation with life's limits. Politically, Jaspers lived his own philosophy. During the Nazi regime, he resisted both fascism and, later, the rise of dogmatic communism. After the war, he warned about mass conformity and the abuse of technology, urging personal responsibility in public life. Though not as famous as Heidegger or Sartre, Jaspers' influence runs deep. Existential psychology, theology, and even modern medicine all echo his insight. His legacy? That true philosophy begins not in comfort, but at the breaking points, where confronting limits forces us to discover freedom. Gabriel Marcel, born in Paris in 1889, lived through both world wars, experiences that deeply shaped his philosophy. Trained as a playwright and music critic before turning philosopher, Marcel never entirely left the stage. His style was conversational, reflective, more like dialogue than dry theory. Unlike Sartre or Camus, he rooted his existentialism in faith, becoming known as the first Christian existentialist. For Marcel, the modern world was increasingly inhuman. He saw mass society, technology, and consumerism turning people into objects, reducing relationships to functions. Against this, he emphasized being over having. True life, he argued, is not in possessions or roles, but in presence, the way we give ourselves to one another in fidelity, love, and hope. He distinguished problem from mystery. A problem can be solved from the outside, like math or engineering. A mystery, by contrast, involves us love, suffering, faith. You can't dissect or escape these. You live through them. For Marcel, philosophy needed to recover this sense of mystery. At the heart of his thought was theistic trust. Where Sartre spoke of absurd freedom, Marcel spoke of hope grounded in God and in our bonds with others. Authentic existence meant resisting alienation and affirming relationships of trust and intimacy. Though less famous than Sartre, he influenced existentialist theology and offered an alternative voice during France's post-war debates. Marcel's legacy endures as a reminder. Even in a fractured, technological age, meaning is found not in solitary conquest, but in faithful connection to others and to God. Paul Tillich, born in Germany in 1886, lived through 2 world wars and watched his country collapse into fascism. As a pastor and scholar, he wrestled with a terrifying question: how can faith survive in a world torn by violence, doubt, and despair? Forced into exile by the Nazis, he moved to the United States, where his lectures and books made him one of the most influential theologian philosophers of the 20th century. Tillich's gift was translating existentialism into theology. He agreed with Kierkegaard, Jaspers, and Heidegger. Human beings live under the weight of existential anxiety. He said there are 3 root anxieties: fate and death, emptiness and meaninglessness, guilt and condemnation. These aren't just psychological quirks. They're baked into being human. So what's the way through? Tillich called it the courage to be. Courage isn't fearlessness. It's the resolve to affirm life and meaning despite fear, despair, or uncertainty. For Tillich, God was not a bearded man in the sky, but the ground of being itself, the depth that makes courage and meaning possible when every surface certainty crumbles. His theology was controversial. Some criticized him for being too abstract, while others admired his ability to bridge philosophy, psychology, and religion. He influenced not only Christian thought, but also psychotherapy, where his language of depth, anxiety, and courage resonated far beyond theology. Tillich's long-term impact? He reframed faith for the modern era, not as blind dogma, but as the act of courage that faces anxiety honestly, trusts the depth of being, and chooses to live fully in a fractured world. Emmanuel Levinas, born in 1906 in Kaunas, Lithuania, grew up in a Jewish family and later studied philosophy in France and Germany, where he sat in Heidegger's lectures. But history marked him even more deeply. He fought in World War II, was captured, and spent 5 years in a German prison camp while his family in Lithuania was murdered in the Holocaust. That trauma shaped everything he would write after. Most existentialists asked, how do I live authentically in the face of anxiety, death, or absurdity? Levinas turned the question upside down. For him, philosophy begins not with self, but with the other. He developed the idea of the face-to-face encounter. When I truly look at another person's face, not as an object, not as a thing, I am immediately confronted with their vulnerability and mortality. In that moment, I'm called to a demand beyond choice. You are responsible. Ethics, he said, is not secondary, it's first philosophy. This radical view countered Heidegger's self-focused ontology. Levinas insisted that existence finds its meaning not in solitary struggle, but in infinite responsibility for others, especially the weak, the poor, the stranger. His writings, especially Totality and Infinity, 1961, influenced everything from theology and politics to postmodern thought. Though dense and difficult, his impact is enduring. In a century scarred by mass violence, Levinas argued that real philosophy starts in compassion. Levinas's legacy is a profound reorientation of existentialism. Meaning does not begin with the isolated individual. It begins in the obligation we owe to the face before us. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, born in France in 1908, was a close friend and colleague of Sartre and de Beauvoir, but he carved his own path. Where Sartre examined freedom and choice at the level of consciousness, Merleau-Ponty asked a deeper, everyday question: what does existence feel like from inside the body? As a phenomenologist, he studied experience not as abstract theory, but as it's lived. His masterwork, Phenomenology of Perception, 1945, argued that we are not just minds housed in machines. We are embodied beings. Meaning is formed through our body's interaction with the world, through seeing, touching, moving. Even perception, far from being passive, is an active engagement with reality. This was a huge shift. Philosophers had long separated mind and body. Merleau-Ponty reunited them. He showed how gestures, habits, and even pre-conscious bodily know-how ground freedom and identity. For example, a pianist plays not by deliberate thought each moment, but by lived bodily memory. In that sense, our body is the anchor of existence. Politically, he broke with Sartre over communism, criticizing blind ideological commitments. Philosophically, he died tragically young at 53, leaving unfinished work called The Visible and the Invisible. Yet, even incomplete, his influence has been massive on psychology, cognitive science, art, and feminist theory. Merleau-Ponty's legacy highlights a truth often overlooked in existentialism. We don't just think our way into existence. We inhabit it. Life is lived through our embodied presence in the world, moment to moment. José Ortega y Gasset, born in Madrid in 1883, grew up in a Spain torn between tradition and modernity. Educated in both Spain and Germany, he became a leading voice in Spanish philosophy, journalism, and politics. One of those rare thinkers who could write dense philosophy and fiery newspaper columns with the same force. His most famous line was, I am my circumstance, and if I do not save it, I do not save myself. What did he mean? Unlike Descartes, who started philosophy with the isolated, I think, therefore I am, Ortega argued that the self cannot be pulled out of its environment. You're always shaped by your history, your culture, your concrete circumstances. But, and this is crucial, that doesn't excuse passivity. To live authentically is to take radical responsibility for both yourself and the situation you're in. This gave Ortega's existentialism a unique social and political edge. In books like The Revolt of the Masses, 1930, he warned that in modern democracies, individuals often surrender to herd mentality, letting mass man drift without vision. What society needs, he argued, are individuals who embrace their freedom and steer history consciously rather than being carried by it. As a public intellectual, Ortega influenced Spanish politics during the fragile years of the Republic, though his moderate liberal vision was later overshadowed by civil war and Franco's dictatorship. His legacy? A philosophy rooted not only in solitude or despair, but in engagement with a world we inherit. Ortega reminds us, you're not a free spirit floating in a vacuum. You are freedom in context, and it's your task to take your life and circumstance together as one project. Franz Kafka, born in Prague in 1883 to a middle-class Jewish family, never planned on being remembered as one of the most existential voices of the 20th century. By day, he worked in an insurance office, buried under paperwork and bureaucracy. By night, he wrote feverishly, creating dark, surreal stories that captured the modern condition better than most philosophers. His fiction gave haunting form to existential anxiety. In The Metamorphosis, 1915, Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning to find himself transformed into a giant insect. The absurdity isn't just a transformation, it's the reaction. His family, overwhelmed by shame and inconvenience, treat him like clutter. Here, Kafka turns dehumanization and alienation into lived nightmare. In the trial, 1925, published after his death, Joseph K. is arrested by a shadowy bureaucracy, but never told what crime he has committed. The endless procedures, meaningless delays, and faceless authorities reflect the absurd machinery of modern society, where individuals feel trapped in systems that care nothing for them. Kafka's life mirrored his themes. He struggled with domineering parents, fragile health, and deep insecurity. He died young at 40 from tuberculosis, leaving most of his work unpublished, with instructions for it to be destroyed. Thankfully, his friend Max Brod ignored him, ensuring these works survived. Today, the word Kafkaesque has entered our language to describe the nightmarish absurdity of faceless systems and inescapable alienation. Kafka's legacy goes beyond literature. He dramatized the existential unease of modern life, showing that sometimes the truest philosophy can be lived out in stories, not arguments. Miguel de Unamuno, born in Bilbao, Spain, in 1864, was a novelist, poet, and professor who became one of Spain's most provocative philosophers. He lived during decades of national turmoil, wars, dictatorship, and cultural decline, which shaped his obsession with the meaning of existence. Unamuno called philosophy not an academic exercise, but a matter of life and death. His central idea was the tragic sense of life. Humans, he argued, long for immortality, for permanence beyond death, but our reason tells us it's impossible. This clash, between fate's hunger for eternity and reason's denial, is the engine of authentic existence. Unlike rationalist philosophers who tried to resolve the tension neatly, Unamuno said we must live inside it. To be human is to embrace contradiction, doubt and hope, despair and faith side by side. He argued that true spiritual depth comes not from certainty, but from wrestling with uncertainty. Politically, he never shied away from controversy. He openly criticized both right-wing authoritarianism and left-wing excess in Spain. Famously, during the Spanish Civil War, at a rally supporting Franco's fascists, he stood up and declared, "You will win, but you will not convince." That courage nearly cost him his life. Unamuno's works, like The Tragic Sense of Life, 1912, and the novel Mist, remain existential classics, bridging literature and philosophy. His lasting message? That our deepest humanity lies in embracing the tragic tension between faith and doubt, refusing to give in to easy answers. Unamuno reminds us, meaning is born not from certainty, but from the struggle itself. Martin Buber, born in Vienna in 1878, grew up in a Jewish family and became one of the 20th century's greatest philosophers of dialogue. While Nietzsche and Heidegger often focused on the self alone, Buber insisted that existence is fundamentally relational. His key idea comes from his classic book, I and Thou, 1923. For Buber, we experience the world in two fundamentally different modes. The first is I-it. Here, we treat things, including sometimes people, as objects, useful, measurable resources to manipulate. Most of modern life runs on I-it. But then there's I-thou. This is the moment of genuine encounter, where I meet another being, whether a person, nature, or even God, not as an object, but as a partner in presence. In I-thou, there's no control, no agenda, only mutual recognition and openness. For Buber, this is the highest mode of existence, the space where authenticity comes alive. Though rooted in Jewish mysticism, his philosophy resonated far beyond religion. He argued that our social and political crises, alienation, conflict, dehumanization, come from reducing others to its peace and meaning require rebuilding I-thou relations, real dialogue, empathy, and community. Buber's own life mirrored his thought. He promoted Jewish-Arab dialogue in Palestine, resisted both dogmatic nationalism and empty individualism, and became a moral voice for human coexistence. His legacy? Buber reminded existentialism that being is never isolated. To exist authentically is not just to face death alone, but to face another's eyes and say, Thou.